Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. For those of you who are coming in and looking at this packed house, there are still a few seats, even in the most exclusive spot in the house, the front row. And there. Be very brief and pass the microphone on to people who have more to say than I do. I just want to tell you what the Humanities Forum is, because sometimes people ask me, I say, oh, I direct the Humanities Forum. They're like, wait, what is that? And what am I doing here? What's going on in this room? I thought this was a classroom. Well, it is a classroom, but today you're not here for a class. You're here for the forum. So let me tell you a few things about it. So, okay, first thing is it's an initiative of the Humanities program, and it offers you an interdisciplinary approach to your studies, to your life at PC, that seeks to integrate humanistic inquiry with Providence College's distinctly Catholic and Dominican mission. And the forum in particular is an occasion outside of class to encounter new ideas, to hear from scholars from around the country and indeed around the world, to ask sort of the bigger questions and to deepen your appreciation for the humanities. So in terms of what are we going to do here today, this is the format. So thing number one is you're going to close those laptops down, because you're here to listen and to talk and to share ideas, not to distract your neighbors or indeed yourselves. Then we'll welcome our speaker. We'll give a robust round of applause. And after her talk, which will run about 45 minutes, we'll have a question and answer period. And if you've ever been to a forum before, you will know that if you're a student, you have to ask the first question. So no sitting there waiting for your professors to think of something smart to say. So be on your toes, and as you're listening, formulate a good question, and you'll have time to ask at the end. The last part, after we've had a Q&A, around 4:50 or so, we will rise as one, book it down the hallway to the Fiandella Great Room, where there's reception with appetizers and iced tea, which says it's unsweetened, but it tastes really sweet to me, and other good things like that. Anyway, I'm going to turn the microphone over now to Professor Aaron Schmidt from the theater department, who will introduce our guest today.
Good afternoon, everyone. As a theater professor, I'm so happy to see so many people in a room for a talk that has theater in the title. So thank you for being here. And I'm excited to welcome Dr. Weiss. Dr. Naomi Weiss is professor of classics at Harvard University, where she has been since 2014. She received her BA and master's from the University of Oxford and a Ph.D. from UC Berkeley. Much of her research has centered on the performance of archaic and classical Greek poetry, especially tragedy. Her first book, The Music of Tragedy, Performance and Imagination in Euripidean Tragedy, was published in 2018. She has co-edited 2 volumes, Genre in Archaic and Classical Poetry, Theories and Models, and Music and Memory in the Ancient Greek and Roman Worlds. Her second monograph, which has just been published, bears the same title as her talk, Seeing Theater, the Phenomenology of Ancient Greek Drama. And just a little bit about Dr. Weiss's presentation. The ancient Greek theatron was literally the place for seeing. In this talk, Professor Weiss will explore how frequently classical Greek drama exposes and interrogates the spectator's own viewing experience. Drawing on a range of textual and visual evidence, she will argue that by making the representational machineries of their productions intelligible and available, Greek tragedy, comedy, and satyr play invite their audiences to participate in the production of meaning. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Naomi Weiss.
Thank you so much. Is my mic working okay? Okay, great. It's amazing to see such a big crowd. I'm really delighted, and I'm so honored to be invited to talk about this new book of mine. That's an amazing opportunity for me. So as you've already heard, and as you can see, my talk today is on this recently published book, and it bears the same title, Seeing Theatre. It's about seeing theatre in Athens in the 5th century BCE. That is, seeing tragedy, comedy, and also satyr play, less commonly known now than tragedy and comedy. That's a type of drama performed after every tragic trilogy involving a chorus of satyrs, horse-human hybrids. We'll come back to them. This is about how the act of seeing is examined both in classical Greek plays and in vase painting, which is the only surviving visual archive contemporary with the plays themselves that offers traces of theatre practice in the 5th century BCE. It's about the spectator's own viewing experience and how playwrights and artists experimented with the instability and ambiguity in visual perception. Plays performed in, as we heard, the theatron, literally the place for seeing in Greek, frequently raise the question of how we see and reveal its complexity. Such an interrogation of theatre's visuality is also an interrogation of theatre's mechanisms of representation. But this isn't, as a result, a distancing of the audience. That's what somebody like Bertolt Brecht was known for. Rather, I argue, it involves a distinctive form of immersion, not in the sense of getting lost in a dramatic illusion, but in terms of a deep and often bodily engagement with a drama's construction. An audience can become part of a dramatic production, not just seeing theatre, but making theatre. The book, and therefore my talk today, is not an attempt to reconstruct what classical Greek theatre looked like. And this is where it might be helpful for me to explain part of the cover. This appears on the cover of the book. The seated pair in the center of this image is based on our only surviving image in Athenian art of a theatre audience, painted on this kous, or wine jug, which is, as you can see, fragmentary and much eroded. Much ink has been spilled on what's going on here. What play is being performed, what character the guy on stage on the right is playing, what the curved structure on the right might represent. We can't determine any of these things with any certainty. And what I find actually much more interesting is the focus on theatrical spectatorship itself. Actors, chorus, musician, judges, and audience, all of those were there within the context of a dramatic competition in Athens. They've all been reduced to an exchange between a single performer and two spectators. The spectators have been variously identified. Maybe they're two judges, a judge with the chorus director, a judge with a dramatic poet, or maybe just regular audience members. Whoever they may be, the scene invites its viewer to position themselves alongside this pair, to look upon the actor and the physical properties of his performance space, and perhaps also, like modern scholars, to wonder about their potential objects of representation. What is going on that stage? In my book, I'm not describing a view, but instead I'm kind of trying to sit there with those two guys, with those two spectators. At the same time, this also is not an attempt to reconstruct in any straightforward way an audience's experience of a drama. And to explain what I mean by this, I'm going to go back to what first got me thinking about the visuality of Greek drama to begin with, and then the theoretical models that I ended up using in my approach. When I was turning my Ph.D. dissertation into my first book, which you so kindly mentioned already, The Music of Tragedy, I ended up spending a lot of time with a fragment of a 7th century BCE maiden song in Greek Partheneon. This is by a poet called Alcman, and it's a choral song sung by a group of young girls with two leaders, and they're called Hagesicora and Agido. Both these names mean choral leader, so they're roles for two of the girls performing in this chorus to play. This is a really tricky song for us to understand, but in the middle of it, the chorus envisions Hagesikora and Agido as a series of figures and objects, and this is what you see here on the screen. I'm going to read it out. Don't you see? The horse is enetic, but the hair of my cousin Hagesikora blooms like unmixed gold, and her silver face, but why do I speak about what's obvious? This is Hagesikora here, and second in beauty, Agido, a Calaxian horse, next to an Ibenian one, will run. For these doves, or maybe they're the Pleiades, the stars, for us as we bring a robe to Orthria through the ambrosial night, rising like the Sirius star, are fighting. Pretty confusing lines. Anastasia Erasmia Peponi, who's a professor at Stanford, has a fantastic 2004 article on the use of metaphor and deixis, pointing at things, in this part of Alkman Fragment 1. She shows how the chorus urges on the audience a form of imaginative viewing or visualizing, so that it's invited not to, and I quote here, to see what is really present, but instead, while looking at what is present, to imaginatively transform the actually visible agents and their actions into a virtual and imaginary spectacle. So through the chorus's description, the audience can see these two girls, Hagesikora and Agido, themselves in the roles of these two figures, as horses, precious metals, birds, and stars. For my first book, this fragment helped me to show how the imaginative interplay between words, music, and dance goes way back, long before our earliest surviving tragedies. But I kept coming back to Alkman's song, along with this article, and thinking more about the questions that the chorus poses. Don't you see? And why do I speak about what's obvious? On the one hand, these questions urge on the audience an awareness of its own role as spectator and a kind of complicity in the representational play at work in this choral performance. On the other hand, they hold out the possibility that the audience actually does not see Hagesikora and Agido as horses, metals, doves, or stars. And what the chorus claims to be obvious are multiple possible objects of representation, multiple ways of seeing its two leaders as it flits from horses to metals, to doves, to stars, while simultaneously reasserting their identities as these two figures, Hagesikora and Agido. There isn't a simple one-to-one process of transformation here. An audience doesn't automatically see these girls as any one of these objects, nor do they necessarily see them in the same way at the same time. And all the while, the chorus keeps us aware of their leaders' own bodies, their hair, their faces, their physical presence right here and now. Prompted by Peponi, I started thinking about this song against Aristotle's, much later, 4th century BCE, discussion of mimesis and visual perception in his Poetics. Just before shifting his focus specifically to drama, Aristotle refers to the visual arts to explain, as he puts it, the pleasure all men take in mimetic objects. So he says, as you can see here, people delight in looking at images, and he gives an example of a wall painting, because it happens that through perceptively seeing, theoruntas in Greek, they learn and infer about what each part is. For example, that this is that, or this person is that person. It's a very neat phrase in Greek, houtos ekeinos. Aristotle is focused here on the viewer's aesthetic experience, and the pleasure of this experience derives from our connecting a figure in a painting with what it represents, and in doing so appreciating how it represents. In both Poetics and also another treatise, Rhetoric, Aristotle notes that metaphor works similarly. It involves identifying this is that. This is a cognitive process requiring a particular way of seeing, for which he again uses this same verb, theorein. Peponi uses this formulation by Aristotle to reread Alcman's song, as she puts it, an initiation into the art of theorein, the art of seeing, or creatively seeing, as she says. But if we work in the other direction, Alcman makes us see how Aristotle's formulation is suspiciously neat and tidy. The painting example in Poetics 4 is clearly meant to apply to the experience of theatre. And this snappy phrase, "this is that," which is a combination of these two deictic pronouns, actually echoes its occurrence in many scenes of recognition in classical Greek drama. So to give one example, in Sophocles' Electra, Electra is trying to reassure her brother Orestes that, yes, I really am Electra, and she says, "this is that." Aristotle's shorthand for mimesis might have us think that the visuality of Greek theatre is therefore simple and stable. Essentially, that there's a kind of one-to-one relationship between what the surviving script says and how an audience sees each prop and body. But Alcman, this 7th century poet, attunes us to the complexity of seeing theatre or seeing choruses, because choruses were a huge part of seeing tragedy, comedy, or satyr play. They're all choral genres. Alcman's chorus presents us with multiple possible that's, while simultaneously reasserting this, the bodily presence of their two leaders. In this, Alcman actually is closer to modern theatre studies than to Aristotle, and specifically to work on the phenomenology of theatre. And for this, there are two classic books. One is by Bert States from 1985, Great Reckonings in Little Rooms, and the other from 1997 is Stanton Garner Jr.'s Bodied Spaces. Bert States emphasizes the actuality, the kind of physical presence, corporeality of the theatrical medium itself and the bodies within it over kind of semiotics, signifying systems. Those tend to privilege text over material presence. Drawing on both States' work and also the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, Garner argues, both here and in later work, that all theatre is characterized by what he calls a play of actuality, which is like an unstable oscillation flitting between the virtual and actual, or you could say the presentational and representational. So, for example, on the one hand, if we're watching King Lear, we see Lear as Lear in the virtual world created for him by Shakespeare's play. On the other hand, we see the actor and the actor's body. As Garner puts it, the actor's body never ceases asserting itself in its material, physiological facticity. So the bodied experience of theatre, that's its phenomenology, always involves some degree of actuality. As Garner shows, even the realist theatre of Ibsen, precisely by incorporating so much of the real world beyond the theatre, actually exposes its limits of representation. Alcman, States, and Garner inform my own phenomenological approach to ancient Greek theatre. I'm interested in the slippage and friction between actuality and virtuality, presence and absence, moments across tragedy and, sorry, I realized I needed that slide up, moments across tragedy, comedy, and satyr play, where viewers are invited to see this and that together, to notice the disconnect between this and that, or to see multiple that's for the one this. Plays that prevent any identification at all of onstage bodies and objects and spaces for a remarkably long time. Plays that push against the bounds of representation altogether through, for example, bodies that are described as dystheatos, which in Greek doesn't just mean difficult to see, but unseeable. So finally, I return to what my book, and therefore this talk, is not. I said it's not an attempt at reconstruction, either of what the set, props, or costumes of a particular performance looked like, or of an audience's precise response to a performance. Older approaches to spectatorship in Greek theatre tended to look at theorein as a specifically Athenian political activity. So to be seen, to be and to be seen as a spectator of theatre was to be part of the performance of democracy. I instead approach theorein like Aristotle does, that is, as an aesthetic activity. And in doing so, I'm part of a more general move in the study of Greek theatre away from semiotics and instead towards the sensory, embodied, cognitive involvement of an audience, a move that has rightly shown how Athenian drama activates all the senses, not just sight. So even while this is a book about seeing theatre, I'm insisting on the fundamental instability of this perceptual act of seeing and also on the various sensory experiences that shape it. So now it's time to try to show you how I do this. I'm going to give just 2 case studies today. A section of a comedy by Aristophanes first performed in 414 BCE, that is his Birds, and a mixing bowl or a crater that is currently in Naples. Together, I hope that these 2 examples will show you something of my transmedial approach to the visuality of classical Greek theatre. I like to use pots and plays. So let me now begin with Aristophanes' Birds. I'm just showing you this table of contents for a moment first, however. In chapter 2, I analyze this comedy in detail alongside 2 plays by Aeschylus, the tragedian, Theoroi, of which we only have fragments, and this is a satyr play. I mentioned this genre that we tend to neglect, and Suppliants, or Suppliant Woman, which is a tragedy. Now, while I'm only going to talk about Birds today, and a small section of it at that, I want to emphasize at the outset that I show phenomenological commonalities across these 3 genres. It's actually really unusual in scholarship on Greek drama to bring these genres together. And there's an old idea that the experience of tragedy is completely, fundamentally different from that of comedy, and that still really persists today. I show how all 3 plays explicitly destabilize and deconstruct any equivalences between the means and objects of representation. In doing so, they draw their audiences into an open-ended process of theatrical seeing, theorein, whereby the power of language to construct visual appearance is simultaneously highlighted and undermined. Now, Aristophanes' comedies frequently play with the potential gap or non-convergence between this and that, and the visual disorientation that it can generate. And no surviving comedy does this more than Birds. In this play, 2 disgruntled elderly Athenians called Pisistratus and Euripides find a guy called Tereus. Tereus was once a king, a man, and now he's a hoopo, a bird. More on that in a minute. And with Tereus' help, they build Cloud Cuckoo Land, a city in the sky, and Pisistratus becomes king, god king of this city. Birds centers on the role of words, speech, and sound in transforming onstage bodies, along with masks, costumes, and props. There's in the Greek world, a famous Homeric metaphor, winged words. This becomes literalized in this play. Pisistratus encapsulates that as its tenet by telling one of the characters seeking to join his city that he is winging him by speaking. Everyone becomes winged with words. Such play with the power of language in performance can be understood as part of the comedy's extreme meta-theatricality, reference to its own theatricality. And as one scholar, Gregory Dobrov, has shown, this is bound up with ontological questions about the nature of man. Tereus, as I said, once king of Thrace and now a hoopo, embodies such play about the shifts between man and bird and actor and character. But such meta-theatricality should also be understood in terms of Aristophanes' deep exploration of how a drama can be visually constructed for its audiences. Since much of Birds is concerned with the identification of one thing as something else, it repeatedly exposes the work entailed in seeing theatre, complicating, destabilizing the relationship between this and that, actual and virtual, as well as the role of language in shaping it. Today, I actually want to focus on just one exemplary, rather disturbing passage of this play, But I'm first going to give a sense of what happens beforehand. The first 300 lines are all about how far we might see an actor as a bird. We have apparently real birds that Pysataris and Euripides are initially holding when they enter the theater and come on stage. Then we have an actor who's playing Tereus' slave, and he's a bird, but he's defined by his human role. And then there's these two old guys, the two men themselves, and they're pretending to be birds just through their very words alone. But they don't convince anyone. That is, their speech proves completely ineffectual at making anyone see them as anything other than ordinary men. And then we meet this guy, Tereus, the hoopoe. And finally, the chorus, it's a chorus of 24 birds comes on stage. And in every case, Pysataris and Euripides comment on their costumes and link them to particular species of birds, whether real or not. The birds of this chorus are really not friendly. So Pysataris directs his friend, Euripides, to find objects with which they might defend themselves. So in this passage, he's suggesting that they take up pots as shields, bowls as helmets, and a skewer, in Greek obeliskos, to plant in front of them as a palisade. A little later, the skewer, or obeliskos in Greek, is to be understood rather differently. Pysataris tells Euripides that we must patrol holding our spear, the skewer. The transformation of household objects into weapons highlights the central premise of this entire comedy. This is a very topsy-turvy world where men will become birds, birds are to rule as gods, and Pysataris will ultimately take the place of Zeus. And so everyone and everything are to appear different from what they are. This is an ontological theme, but it's also an aesthetic one, connected to the audience's own viewing experience. Nothing is ever to be viewed or experienced in one fixed way. After the birds have been won over, a new character comes on stage, and this is the nightingale, poor Procne. It's the moment of her entrance that I want to dwell on today. So as I said, the nightingale is Procne, and Procne in the Greek myth is Tereus' wife. In the myth, she takes particularly awful, gruesome revenge on Tereus for raping her sister, Philomela. So she feeds Tereus, her husband, their son, Itys. And then she, Tereus, and her sister, Philomela, are changed into birds. That's how Tereus ends up as a hoopoe. Now, though she's been referred to multiple times earlier in the comedy, she hasn't yet appeared on stage. And yet there's a sense of her presence nonetheless, for Tereus addresses her 400 lines before her physical entrance. And there, as you can see in this passage, he summons her in his song as his song mate to start, I quote, trilling fluid melodies from her vibrant cheeks. And it is at this moment that the audience would hear the musician, the piper, who would accompany every single theatrical performance in Athens. The player of double pipes called the aulos or the auloi, and you see he's not actually playing them at this particular point, but you see an example of what he might have looked like here on this phase. Then, just before her entrance, the nightingale's entrance, the chorus leader emphasizes once again her musicality. She is sweet singing and a singer who sings with the muses. The aulos player, you see another image of him here, actually playing his pipes, would likely accompany these words, providing their sonic manifestation. So in this sense, the nightingale has been there all along. When she does finally appear in person, Pysataris and Euripides act as internal spectators within the play, staging for the audience multiple ways of seeing her. And this is a scene I'm going to focus on. I should say at the outset, the more time I spend with it, the more disturbed I am by it, because it is essentially about the intention to rape her. So Euripides says, "Bring her out here by the gods, so that we too can see the nightingale. Well then, if it seems good to you, I must do this. O Procne, come out and show yourself to the strangers. Oh, much-honored Zeus, what a beautiful birdie. How tender and how fair. Yeah, you know, I'd gladly spread her thighs. What a lot of gold she has, like a young girl, a Parthenos. I think I'd like to kiss her too. But you idiot, she has a couple of skewers for a beak. But like an egg, by Zeus, we have to peel the outer layer off the head and kiss her that way. The nightingale is the explicit object of everybody's sight in this scene. Euripides wants her to come out so that we can all see her, thus encouraging the audience to share in this act of spectatorship, an act that is explicitly bound up with sexual desire and indeed sexual violence. Original or intended stagings of this scene are difficult to determine and much debated. Long ago, someone called Frank Romer suggested that the figure who appears here is not a mute actor, but the aulos, or the pipe player himself. As I said, already the music of this instrument could represent the nightingale's song. And the chorus later makes this identification clear. They actually address the nightingale as one who plays the aulos. Pisistratus' remark that her beak consists of a couple of skewers, and we've again got this Greek word obeliskoi, therefore presumably refers to the two pipes of the aulos, which prevent the addition of a beak mask, or at least a beak attachment. The shell, the eggshell, that they would need to peel off would then refer primarily to what was called the forbea, which was a headband that went around securing the two pipes in place. At the same time, Pisistratus' own confused viewing of the aulos, as he reaches instead for mundane objects like skewers and eggshells to describe these supposed beaks, defamiliarizes the appearance of the musician whom an ancient audience would see in every dramatic production. What is he here? And it generates many of the difficulties faced by those who have tried to reconstruct this scene's staging. So at this point, the audience is not just to hear the aulos player as the nightingale, but to see him as one as well. Depending on the production, it could even be the very first moment that it gets to see the aulos player. The audience could have been awaiting his onstage entrance just as Pisistratus, Euripides, Tereus, and the chorus await the presence of the character that he represents. Slipping between performer and character, he becomes a really multiform figure. Indeed, he appears not only as a nightingale, but also later, this is a weird play, as a raven. So the chorus at this point is performing a processional song to mark the beginning of their city's inaugural sacrifices, and they refer to their song's piped accompaniment. And at that point, Pisistratus remarks that he has never before seen a raven wearing a forbea, which again is this headband that is worn by the aulos player, the aulite. In doing so, he emphasizes the audience's own unfamiliarity with what this play's bodies and objects might represent. So in this scene, both internal spectators and with them the audience itself see before them both aulos player and nightingale. But these are not the only ways to identify this figure, as the reactions of Pisistratus and Euripides demonstrate. When Pisistratus mentions how much gold she's wearing, like Parthenos, like a young girl, he seems to allude to the Parthenos. The Parthenos was a famously very, very golden statue done by the famous sculptor Phidias. Euripides' desire to spread her thighs and kiss her, however, makes it clear that they also see this figure not as the Parthenos, Athena, nor as a virginal young girl, Parthenos, but as somebody called an aulatress. This was a female pipe player and typically also sex worker who would entertain men at a symposium. So the difficulties of seeing this aulos player, aulatress, female pipe player as a nightingale are then translated into a problem of sexual contact. They can't kiss her because she's got the skewers, the obeliskoi. Now previously, if you remember, these appeared as onstage props to be used as weapons against the bird chorus. Now, the two pipes of the aulos are the obeliskoi, to be understood as 5 potential things at once, not just pipes, skewers, and beak, but also palisades and spears, which make any sexual advance dangerous. So the multiple overlapping identifications for both the pipe skewers and the figure who carries them encourage a flexibility in the audience's own gaze, a simultaneous viewing of multiple potential that's for the onstage this. Ironically, however, for all this emphasis on the Nightingale's visual appearance, it is its acoustic representation that determines the identification between aulos player and bird. We saw how before her entrance she's already present sonically through the sound of these pipes. After the Nightingale piper has appeared and Pisistratus and Euripides have gone inside, the chorus makes the reliance on sound for sight explicit. It exclaims, you've come, you're here to see, bringing sweet sound to me. So finally, the nightingale has been spotted, and in Greek it's literally, ophthais, you've been seen. But she still primarily exists in terms of sound, through the sound of the pipes. It is above all through this music and instrument, and the instrument that produces it, not through costume or masks, that she can be visualized. This sort of play with the different ways we might see men as birds can be directed at the audience, not simply as viewers, but as figures viewed as themselves an object of spectatorship. The Nightingale scene is followed by what is called the parabasis, which is a moment when the chorus leader directly addresses the audience. He twice invites them to join the chorus as birds. The second time, he imagines what would happen if one of you spectators had wings. He begins by imagining a spectator who's really hungry, and he just doesn't want to be there for the tragedy, the performances of tragedy, so he just flies away, has lunch, and then comes back. And he goes on to consider what various other members of the audience would do if they could fly. Then Pisistratus and Euripides re-enter, and now finally they have the wings. They really do have wings, apparently, themselves. So they're in the state that the chorus leader has been imagining for the spectators. As Pisistratus comes on stage, he exclaims, "Ta-da! By Zeus, I've never seen a funnier thing." Now, I've translated the phrase here as ta-da. Sorry to be technical, but in Greek, it's actually tautit toiauti. And this is an expression that's actually very close to Aristotle's this is that, or houtos ekenos. Literally, it means this here is of just such a sort, or less literally, what you see here is what you just heard about. So immediately following the chorus leader's remarks about winged spectators, you out there all being winged, it may momentarily be somewhat ambiguous to whom or what this expression refers. Now, a few lines later, it's clear that Pisistratus is talking about Euripides and their own wings. But ta-da, tauti, toiauti, could also seem to refer to the audience. It has become toiauta, of such a sort. It is the funny sight, momentarily seen or visualized as birds. The flexible viewing of theater is thus applied to the audience itself, as it momentarily becomes the viewed object, transformed into birds through words alone. The rest of this play continues to foreground the technologies used to construct what an audience might or might not see, focusing on costumes, props, and above all language, and the visual framing of costumes and props through language. Over and over again, objects proliferate into multiple possible things, just like those skewer pipes in the Nightingale scene. The play increasingly takes apart the process of seeing theatre, even while the audience is throughout still to see the chorus as birds and individual actors as a whole cast of characters, from ordinary Athenian men to Prometheus and Poseidon even. By the end of the comedy, such kind of representational excess, and with it a sort of verbal deficiency, surrounds Pisistratus himself. He re-enters as a man, as a bird, a new Zeus, and even as Pisistratus, who was a famous 6th century tyrant of Athens, and the similarity between his name, Pisistratus, and Pisistratus is not a coincidence. But the herald who announces his entrance finds that he just doesn't have the words to describe him. Everything is greater than words can say, or impossible to describe. He attempts to use similes, like he's like a meteor, or like the sun itself, but then he just gives up. He prepares the audience for a beautiful sight by talking about smell, But even the smell that he says is there is unnameable. Finally, Paisitarus enters, and the herald simply says, well, here he is himself. Even as he seems to have almost unlimited representational potential, Paisitarus is still this here, a bit like Hagesicora, there in bodily form. Even now, he is an everyman comic hero within the play and a masked and costumed body in the theatre. Aristophanes' Birds thus explores the power but also the limits of language in combination with other technologies of theatre to shape theatre's phenomenology, its visual, lived experience. It is a play about winging with words, but it is as much about the instability and incompatibility of verbal description and visual appearance as it is about how these combine. In this respect, it's an extreme example of how classical Greek plays draw attention to how language, as well as more generally voice and sound, can form, transform, and unform the visual experience of theatre. In Birds, as in that song by Alcman, everything can be visualized in multiple different ways: pots and shields, pipes and beaks, skewers, stakes, and palisades. The play doesn't simply deny a convergence of this and that. It repeatedly presents several, often conflicting representational possibilities for what both internal and external spectators see. In the end, Paisitarus himself exceeds any verbal description at all, appearing in such an incongruous position as man-bird Zeus that he is indescribable. For the rest of this talk, perhaps to your relief, I am going to move from text to image and set this pot, a red figure mixing bowl, so you mix wine and water in it, or crater, against my reading of Aristophanes' Birds, especially the nightingale scene. As I mentioned, I discussed this object, well, actually I didn't mention, I discussed this object in chapter 4 of my book, where I explore the potential of Athenian vase painting, which is an entirely different medium, to shed light on the visual experience of theatre. Again, I should say what I do not do here. I do not use vases as photographic snapshots of a production, as philologists so often have, nor do I contend any direct relationship between them and tragedy, comedy, or satyr play. Instead, I explore how we might find in vase paintings resonances, echoes of theatrical modes of viewing, referring back to strategies and effects at work in the textual material on which the rest of the book is focused. So, on this pot, which is another kind of weird thing to look at and think about, we see an aulos player, pipe player, flanked by two performers in bird costumes. Most images that can be linked with some certainty to comedy in 5th century Attic vase painting, including the kous, the object that I began with, appear on smaller, cheaper pottery, not designed for an audience in a symposium or for export. Those vases, produced from the 430s BC and into the early 4th century, accentuate the artifice of theatre. This crater is unusual among the majority of classical Attic vase paintings connected to comedy in several respects, in its size, its sympathetic function, and the richness of its design. As I show, this object does draw attention to theatre's technologies, but it also engages in its own play between actuality and virtuality. The aulos player stands in a frontal pose right in the center of this scene, as you can see. His fingers are spread across the two pipes of the aulos, and his cheeks are bulging from the circular breathing required to play them. He wears an elaborate tunic, which is decorated with a mixture of geometric motifs and images of chariots and animals. And his body is slightly turned to the left. You can see that the right hem of the tunic rises up, and his right foot appears tilted back, as if he's in movement. The two figures on either side of him are in bird costumes, decorated with dots and circles. They wear wings, beaked masks with crests, and attached to their little shorts, which were a common part of a theatrical attire called perisdomata, we see tails and phalluses. Phalluses are also attached to their boots as cockspurs. Both bird performers face the aulos player and appear to be dancing in response to his music, bending their legs and raising their arms towards him. This crater was originally thought to illustrate a moment in Aristophanes' Birds, but now we can see that it predates that play by at least a decade. It is iconographically similar to several other surviving vase paintings. So on the left, you see a wine jug in Atlanta, dated to the 420s. There are also several much older Attic Athenian black figure pots from the late 6th or early 5th century that show two men in bird costumes dancing to the music of an aulos player, and you see one example there on the right. Its iconographic similarities with those older pots complicate any attempt to reconstruct a precise contemporary referent, and certainly we shouldn't assume that the users of this crater in Italy, where it ended up, would have recognized it. But in a general sense, the object of representation on this crater initially seems self-evident: an aulos player with two dramatic performers playing birds. Given their dance movements in response to the musician and their matching costumes, the two bird figures are usually understood to be members of a chorus, possibly given their crests, and there's a waddle visible beneath one of their chins. Possibly they represent roosters. Yet the scene still holds out various questions. Above all, what kind of performance is this? It's assumed to be a comedy, but the erect phalluses are more typical of a satyr play, and so they complicate that identification. And perhaps if the performance represented here is indeed a theatrical one, the individuated movements of the two bird figures could suggest that they're actors rather than chorus members. For us, but perhaps also for some of the pot's ancient viewers, the scene leaves various representational possibilities open. At the same time, this image involves us in the performance it represents, which we can at least say is some form of dramatic play. Discussions of this pot usually focus on the bird performers, but the focal point here is the aulos player, the pipes player, a figure supposedly outside of the bird's virtual avian world. He stands in the center, framed by the performers on either side, and every part of those two figures frames and points towards him: their hands, their knees, their feet, and their erect phalluses. The phalluses are part of their costumes, but their positioning nonetheless suggests that the bird character's response to the aulos player and his music is not just kinetic, but erotic. His unusual frontal depiction means that he also draws the viewer's attention towards his body and instrument. So we see the dancing phallic bodies looking at and being erotically drawn to the aulos player, but he looks at us, not them, and so he encourages a similar response, as if we too can see and hear his musical performance. Like the chorus leader in Birds, when he addresses the audience, the aulos player thus disrupts the representational frame. He reaches out. He doesn't just reach out towards the viewer's own world, but urges on him a bodily response, here a sexual response, like that of his internal spectators. The erotic focus on the aulos player here may also remind us of that disturbing nightingale scene in Birds. The bird figure's reaction may primarily be to the music that he produces and as an instrumental accompaniment, but their physical proximity and erotic attention suggest that he himself could be assuming or be imagined to assume a dramatic role. That is, we could see him rather like the aulos player in Birds playing the nightingale, whose sexual appeal Pisistratus and Euripides urge upon the audience. As we saw, those two characters, by focusing on the instrument, allude to the sexual act she might perform, even as they remind us that this is an aulos player with his skewer pipes. The aulos player on the crater, depicted at the center of the performance with all sight lines drawn to him and engaging us as spectators alongside those infatuated bird figures, invites us to wonder about what parts he and his instrument could play. Even though he's clearly not a character, he has a human, bearded, unmasked head, and that contrasts starkly with the elaborate masks on either side. But we still think about the dramatic or fictional relationship between him and these bird characters. That he is unmasked leaves open what or who he might represent and how we may be led, however briefly, to visualize such a figure. At the same time, his bare face may prompt us to wonder about the humans under the bird masks next to him, the actors whom we are to see as birds. The aulos itself assumes a representational flexibility. Apologies for this, as the blowing of its two pipes right next to two erections can be viewed as distinctly phallic. The image's eroticism thus suggests, as the nightingale scene suggests in Birds, that the aulos need not simply be a piece of theatrical technology. Its material presence, as well as the sound it produces, can simultaneously play a role within the virtual world being represented. The aulos player's clothing also brings us closer to the virtual object of the performer's dramatic representation by encouraging us to see it as both the instrumentalist's costume and as something more. Classical vase paintings often show theatre aulos players wearing elaborate costumes, but this one, with its images of chariots, winged horses, deer, and hares, is extraordinary. It seems to communicate more than the reality of the aulos player's appearance in the theatre. It also suggests something about his tune and the song that it accompanies. The decorations create a visual impression of musical intricacy for which this instrument was renowned, but they can also call to mind the sorts of animals to which the performance of choral song, like that chorus of Alkmund's song, frequently assimilate themselves, in particular birds and horses, which we saw there in that song. The animals depicted on this musician's tunic thus provide an imaginative counterpoint to the bird costumes worn by the performers on either side, reminding the viewer of the broader choral musical imaginary amid what otherwise seems to be a highly theatrical display. This aulos player then presents several possibilities for both the identities we might see him assume and the figures that can become materialized through his music and the choral song and dance that it accompanies. As we saw, the nightingale in Birds is only really seen as such as a result of the aulos' sound. Her appearance reminds us how seeing theatre is always a synesthetic experience involving other senses in combination with that of sight. When a viewer looks at this pot, this crater, he primarily hears the aulos player through this visual image, but perhaps also through the aulos music performed in the symposium for which this mixing bowl was designed. We have also seen how the aulos player's representational potential is only fully realized through his bodily impact on his internal and external spectators. As I mentioned earlier, aulos players at a symposium were typically slaves and often also sex workers. For a viewer within that context, then, such an acoustic environment and the sexually available bodies that produced it could also shape his experience of the musician represented on the mixing bowl. The other side of this pot can further expand a viewer's understanding of this scene of performance. Here, in place of the musician, is a naked young man in profile, holding, instead of an aulos, a helmet and spear. On either side of him are not birds, but an older man and woman. The similarity in the two sides' composition encourage us to view them in combination as two apparently everyday scenes, some sort of dramatic performance, possibly a comedy, and a mother and father bidding farewell to their son as he goes off to war. And this is a generic scene with its own long iconographic tradition. With us reminded as modern viewers of some of the experiences beyond any one specific dramatic performance that could shape a 5th century Athenian audience's view of theatre. Even if there are no direct connections here with actual Athenian practices, we can see how within the internal system of this pot, from one side to another, bodies become different bodies, objects become different objects. I'm not positing a straightforward relationship between the two scenes, but I find their complementarity productive, a productive parallel for how representation in theatre is never fixed or stable. Some of this instability or flexibility can be generated by the language of a play itself, as we saw with Birds, but it is also closely tied to a performance's materiality and an audience's own bodied presence. a pot can produce its own sort of visual flexibility by combining within the one image, but also across sides and registers, an emphasis on the technologies of theatre with an exploration of the multifaceted virtual realm that they can materialize, and by gesturing beyond theatre to other possible bodies, objects, spaces, sounds, and activities, especially those within the context of the symposium. What this phenomenological approach to different media shows is that from the very beginnings of ancient Greek drama, playwrights and artists understood, to go back to that quote, theatre's phenomenological complexity, a complexity that comprehends, indeed is fueled by, difference and absence. The bird's crater, in particular, also alerts us to the role of a spectator's own body in the act of seeing theatre. By taking apart the process of theatrical representation and pushing it to its limits, the plays that I discuss in my book don't simply activate and extend the sort of cognitive work in which Aristotle is interested, understanding this prop as that thing or this body as that character. They also cue a multi-sensory form of viewing that's grounded in the body. Such viewing involves a deep engagement with a drama's construction, such that a spectator is also a participant. A spectator is as much attuned to the mechanisms of representation in which they themselves play a crucial part as to the virtual world that those mechanisms generate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiss. Great. And so as you heard at the beginning, we always start with a question from a student, so don't be shy, and we can wait for you all. Look at you. Here you go, Danny.
Wonderful explanation on everything. How would you argue, in a modern sense, now that we have all this access to technology, in the terms of theater, to use props and, as you've mentioned, smells, sounds, and sights? Would you say that? Would you say, in the sense that, would it hamper now do you think it hampers the phenomenology that we experience nowadays compared to the archaic and the classical Greek plays, or?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I guess I would never say it hampers, because however sophisticated the technologies of theatre are, it's never so simple as, seeing this actor as that character, especially if it's a famous actor, right? You're always aware that it's not just Hamilton. So even if you've got amazing other technologies, I still think a lot of this complexity is always there, this combination of being aware of an actor's physical body and their identity beyond the character they're playing, as well as the sort of being within the virtual world. The other thing to say is that we tend to assume that early theatre must be simple theatre, technologically speaking, and sure, they didn't have all the stuff that we could do now, but there were some pretty sophisticated things that people could experience, from raising a character up from the middle of the stage, which we think happened for a play called Prometheus Bound, for example, to Deus Ex Machina, gods appearing on a crane. So sure, that again, those aren't, they don't sound so sophisticated to us, but they would be presumably to them. The other thing I should say is that when we think of theatre, we tend to think of like a darkened auditorium. The theatre that I'm talking about is very, very different because it's outdoors. So in that respect, it is different phenomenologically, because you're always aware of, I mean, you are anyway in a darkened auditorium, but even more so outdoors, you're always aware of everybody around you, of things beyond the theatre, as well as what's there in front of you. Thank you, that was a great question.
Hi, thank you again for coming here to speak at the forum. My question was on something you mentioned about the sort of musical accompaniment and how that would sort of, in the social context of classical Greece, harken back to a type of minstrel entertainment or sex worker profession that you had talked about as being a sort of fixture of some symposiums of that time. Could you expand on that more? It's just interesting to look at like that social dynamic.
Thank you. Yes. So I should say this particular instrument, the owl. Oh, wrong direction. We can see it here. The aulos was actually part of Athenian life in many contexts. So even the triremes apparently were rowed to the accompaniment of an aulos, not the beating of a drum, but the aulos, the pipes, which were apparently very loud and had a lot of impact. So it's not that there's only these two contexts in which you would experience this sound. There was a military one as well, and then there were other kinds of competitions and performances just for playing on the aulos, in fact. But especially on pottery, we get an impression that the sort of sexual potential of somebody playing this aulos is often thought about and played with in this, at least in this art form. And also in theatre we get that as well. So even while the aulos player is just an integral part of a theatrical production, tragedies, comedies, satyr plays, they all had choruses, and the choruses sang and danced to the accompaniment of this musician. There are lots of occasions where playwrights sort of draw on these other parts of life where this sound would be heard, whether played by a man, like in the theatre, or played by a woman. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much again for coming. I've been racking my brain as you were talking, and so I guess I'm asking for help to help me remember. I really liked when you were talking about the Alcman and the birds, the way that you sort of went through how the speaker is sort of narrating and guiding audience perceptions. Like first it's one thing, no, it's another thing, no, it's another thing. And I've been trying to remember if an example of a theatrical example where part of the action on stage relies on characters disagreeing over what the audience is supposed to be seeing. Like, this is, a lady. Oh no, it's a cheese grater. That sort of thing. And that, if you have any examples, and just if you could talk a little bit about if there are examples and how disagreements affect audience perception.
That's another great question. Yeah, so this happens quite a lot in comedy, and especially in this play. So, I mean, we don't know what the props actually were. What we have is the text that survives. And in the text that survives, characters are debating as to what a particular thing is. So there are numerous other parts of this particular play where even a pair of wings is described, is called something completely different, like a spinning top. And maybe they are wings on stage, but whenever you feel like, okay, I know what's here as a reader of the text, then that sort of understanding is confused, and something of that is going on for the audience too. That does actually happen in tragedy sometimes too. Aeschylus's Suppliant Woman, which is not a funny play at all, there's a long exchange between another internal spectator, a king of Argos called Pelasgus, and a chorus of women who have come from Egypt and are both distinctly foreign and at the same time emphasizing that they're Greek. And he is really confused by every aspect of their appearance and the sounds that they are making because they are both foreign and Greek. And it's actually crucial for the play that the audience is confused as well. And so there too, they present objects that seem to be one thing, like so, for example, they're holding branches in their hands, but then the next moment they describe them as daggers. And so again, they may well be branches as props in the theatre, but you're not, you're sort of not allowed to feel comfortable with how you understand what you see there. If that makes sense?
Yeah, and so can I follow up? Okay, no, that's what I was wondering. And so, like, then do you think that I hate to talk about audience engagement because that's not really exactly what I mean. But when you have an audience and it's confused, that the playwright is wanting to be confused, what's the effect of that? I mean, do you have any ideas? Because I don't.
I don't know. I think the effect of it, at the very least, is a sort of a real involvement of it. Like, there's nothing passive about this experience. Or if you are sort of not paying attention, then you really are completely missing it. Because so often plays draw the audience in to be like a spectator within the play to try to make sense of it, and often that is quite closely connected to the point of the play. So, yeah, it's not a great answer, and again, it's veering towards a sort of form of engagement. But I do think that there's this sort of for a better term, the discomfort that might be generated here is quite deliberate as a way to bring audiences in. And maybe it is then, in this context, worth emphasizing that we think of theatre now as a very elite activity, but theatre there was a civic event, everybody going to the theatre. So while I'm not talking really about the social importance of theatre in terms of democracy, I think there is something important about this sort of value that Athenians placed on audience participation within a theatrical event. This is a really long answer. The final thing I'll just say is that another difference is that a really high number of audience members at any given point would themselves have performed on stage in this very space. Again, very different from our experience typically of theatre. So that creates another form of, a different form of audience engagement where, like, bodily you can identify with the bodies on stage. And in that sense, too, be drawn into the construction of a drama.
I've been trying to think of how to phrase this as a question. When I saw the title of your talk, really enjoyed, by the way, thank you. I immediately was thinking about that quote you had from Aristotle at the beginning about kind of the joy of sight, the pleasure of sight and seeing imitations. And there's something a little bit odd to me about that identification of the theater primarily with sight, even though it's in the term theater. So much of it, as you brought out, of course, is not sight-based, right? It's the language, the musicality, the actual music. So I'm wondering, sort of in the way you're kind of framing your work, in some ways of kind of disagreeing with the Aristotelian form of interpretation of kind of tragedy and theater, is that another place you sort of see yourself kind of in disagreement? Why is it sight? Why is it the place you go to see? I mean, obviously, in a dialogue, you don't see the actors, even though there's still some imitation. Why is it that you think that there's this strong connection between sight and theater in this discussion about ancient Greek theater?
Thank you. Yeah, so Aristotle, when he's talking about theatre, he's clearly above all interested in the cerebral aspects of theatre. So he's focused on plot and plot construction. And yet he keeps coming back to issues to do with sight, to do with spectacle. And then even as he talks about the pleasure, he's framing it in visual terms. And often doesn't, while he does mention other aspects of theatre like music and dance, he kind of brushes them aside. So I guess I'm trying to show how even if we do, like Aristotle, if we do find ourselves constantly drawn back to this visual paradigm, which scholarship often has, that actually it's always involving these other aspects as well. That said, the theatre, we get our word theatre from a word meaning to see. So clearly that sense is sort of understood as the most important one in this space, but then it's not one that I think is necessarily understood in ancient Greek thought as exclusively vision, sight, as we would say, but one that involves all of these other aspects too. But Aristotle, I think, is uncomfortable with that, and you sort of see that coming through at several points in the Poetics. Thank you.
Hi. You have me thinking about Northrop Frye and his discussion of metaphorical identification. So precisely that this is that. And he says that it's much more pronounced in myth and then in romance, which is close to myth, than in his other genres like the low mimetic or the ironic. And so I guess that leads me to just wonder, is there to what extent have you looked at 4th century comedy, and is this kind of identification similar, or is it very different? Because I think Northrop Frye would think it should be very different, that there's more identification, everything becomes the same the closer you are to myth.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think you've put your finger on a very important part of this particular theatre experience, which is that there is this body of myth where you're going to Sophocles' Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex, and everybody knows the story of Oedipus or Antigone, to at least the bare bones. So there's in some ways there's a sort of it should be obvious that this is that all the time, right? Because the audience has a particular kind of repertoire where they know the story. And then the playwright has to experiment with that and introduce lots of forms of surprise and maybe discomfort. So for example, Electra not necessarily looking like Electra, or Helen not necessarily looking like Helen in her play. And then you say 4th century comedy. Yeah, so as we call the surviving plays of Aristophanes so-called old comedy from the 5th century BCE. We have fragments of other plays from this period, but not full plays other than those by Aristophanes. Later comedy changes and often becomes sort of more romantic. What stays the same compared to old comedy is the sort of the everyday figures. So they're not from myth. So you could say that there is more opportunity there to, that it's kind of like a blank canvas for what anybody is on stage. That's not a Northrop Frye way of looking at it, but yeah, it's a really useful distinction, and I'm going to go on thinking about it.
Okay, so in modernity, when you have productions which are preoccupied with like the viewer's experience and with perception and so on and so forth, I want to say that correlates to times when we feel very uncertain about our perceptions or anxious about them, right? So like an easy example is detective fiction becomes a thing once you have people living anonymous lives in the 19th century city and you don't know anything about, you can't judge people by their cover anymore. And so you have these stories about the difficulty of that, right? And so I was wondering, as you were describing this, where you have all this sort of visual ambiguity or multiplicity built into these plays, is this coming to the fore in the 5th century because there are, I don't know, are there social or cultural or political undercurrents which create the appetite for watching things which call our own perceptions into question?
Another great question. Thank you. Yeah, because I'm showing on the one hand that there's a long history to this sort of play, and on the other hand that the theatre really takes off in the 5th century to the point where by the end of the 5th century BCE, there's even something called the Theoric Fund, which actually is paying people to go to the theatre to have a theoric, to have a seeing experience. So we could say that this is a moment where that experience, that kind of heightened visuality is really important. I don't know to what extent we can connect the sort of more uncomfortable moments of sort of visual disorientation that I was looking at in my talk to political context. I mean, Aristophanes' Birds is performed at a point when Athens is on the cusp of losing the Peloponnesian War. But I haven't yet figured out the connection to make with that and what's going on in the play. There's another play by Aristophanes called The Acharnians, an earlier play, which has actually my favorite scene in all of Greek drama. It's when the main character, Dicaiopoulos, he comes on stage at the beginning of the play, and he's waiting for the assembly to begin, but it's clear that he's waiting for the play itself to begin. And he describes all of his various actions. He farts, he's scribbling, he's looking around, he's getting bored. He's describing all the kinds of things that you might do if you're not fully involved in a theatrical production. But he's also looking out, he describes how he's looking out to the country where he can no longer go, because at that point the Spartans, this is at an earlier point in the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans had ravaged the Athenian countryside, so a lot of Athenians had come into the city. So there's some connection there between his visual experience that he's kind of presenting or modeling in the theater and his longing for being able to see something that's not there, which is his home outside of the city. So maybe that would be one possible example. It's really interesting. I want to think about it more. Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you for this talk, Dr. Weiss. This was wonderful. Just kind of a similar question to Dr. Bernhoft in a way. I don't know if it's erroneous to say that this approach, like what Aristophanes does, is synonymous to breaking the fourth wall or something like in theater. And I feel I don't know if I watch enough theater or not, but I don't know how regular that is, that kind of approach. But I'm not sure if it, I guess one of the questions is was that kind of a regular approach to theater? And then why do you think that is? Why do you think the playwright and the actors really wanted to kind of break through that fourth wall and I guess ensure that the spectators are paying attention or whatever it is? Is there some cultural significance or whatever maybe?
Thank you so much. So the comedies that we have from this period are breaking the fourth wall, exposing the fact that they are theatre all the time, like in that scene I just described in the Acharnians. I would say that tragedy does it also, but not to the same degree, but it does do it. We like to think of Greek tragedy somehow on this different plane. And scholars, too, still like to think of how, you would watch whatever, Aeschylus' Agamemnon or Sophocles' Antigone, and you would just be entirely immersed the whole time, and you would never be aware of the theatrical artifice. But of course you would. And there are quite a few moments, even in those plays, where you can detect that. To give for a classicist, an obvious example, Euripides' Bacchae, there's a lot of play there with references to theatre, culminating in the character Agave, who has unknowingly torn apart her own son, bringing on a stick a mask, the mask that the same actor previously wore when playing the son. And so there's a lot of play with the language of masks as a result, just to give one example. As to why, I think it's really ingrained, again, I use Altman, but it really goes way back. But we don't know, the origins of tragedy and comedy, or tragedy especially, are really murky. But what we do know is that long before the formal competitions that we know about where playwrights would present their work to judges and big audience. There was just a lot of costumed play, so we have a lot of visual evidence of people dressed up as animals, singing and dancing, often to the tune of pipes. And that visual evidence often accentuates the sort of combination of, like in birds, real bird and person dressed up as bird, or real horse and person dressed up as horse. And so that sort of mixture, that sort of oscillation or sort of doubling of a character and a performer all at the same time is, for whatever reason, very much part of this culture. There's more to say in answer to your question, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiss. We very much appreciate you coming. And don't forget, there's a reception in the great room after. Thank you again.